So hello, everybody. Before I introduce our keynote speaker and her presentation, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining this meeting on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of this land, and pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So we're here today to listen to the keynote address by Professor NSWALNC from Sheffield University in England. Jennifer has published many inspirational and perhaps provocative books and papers on literacy and literacy education that I think expand our ways of thinking about literacy and how we can engage our learners in literacy, or I think she would say literacies learning. And her keynote presentation today is called Disrupting Deficits, a Living Literacies Approach to Adult Literacy. And I think all of us here involved in adult literacy work would welcome any ways of disrupting the deficit discourses that have shaped many of our students' lives. And we will learn about living literacies, which is also the title of one of her recent books written with Kate Powell and their co-authors. And as you can see, I have here with me our colleague Polly Craig, adult literacy teacher from North Sydney TAFE, and UTS colleague Dr. Ros Appleby. After Jennifer's presentation, Polly and Ros will join us in a discussion about some of the ideas presented to us by Jennifer. So I think I'll hand over to you, Jennifer, to share the screen. And
okay, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Keiko. She's met with me twice. As you know, she's a lovely person, and also Polly and Roz for coming and sharing their evening with us. And finally, it's always a little intimidating chatting with people on the ground, adult literacy teachers. So I have to say I am intimidated by the group, and I really hope that this is worthwhile and relevant and get some discussion going. So here we go. How's that? Everybody can see? Great. So as Keiko said, I'm going to talk about disrupting deficits, a living literacies approach to adult literacy. I love the title of the conference, Literacies in the Making. It feels like literacy's on the move. So a little bit about thinking about deficits. I was very lucky 20 some years ago to study with Brian Street, who you're probably familiar with his work, and Gunter Kress. And so he really set me on a course to think about literacy in a particular way that I imagine is familiar, but we'll do a little tiny bit of revisiting what that is. So I guess my question is something that you'll be discussing at the conference, which is, what are literacies in the making? So what for adults, what does that mean exactly? How can you think about that in terms of your teaching? And I suppose somebody I love, a theorist, Elizabeth Ellsworth, who I think might be Australian, actually, I could be wrong about that, but and the quote is, "Making entails something in between knowing and not knowing." Now, one of the reasons I like this quote is because more recent turns in literacy have encouraged an understanding of literacy as something that's representational, that's written, that you read, that you think about in terms of tangible, but there's also an affective sensory feel, flaky, I think, but it's a way about thinking about literacy as something that does move us. All right, and I'm sure you have many moments within your teaching where you think about that. But what do we know about language and literacy? Again, I'm preaching to the choir, as they say. Many of you already think about these things all the time on a daily basis. So literacy pervades all aspects of living and learning. If we go back to literacy events, which is what Brian Street and Mary Hamilton and others talk about, literacy is a social practice, right? Literacy isn't something that we just do within the adult literacy classroom. Literacy is something that pervades and moves into all aspects of our lives. So it has these larger social cultural patterns that we engage in all the time. And language and literacy is never neutral. It's not a neutral medium of communication. Our literacy practices come from our cultures, from different languages that we speak, from you being in Australia, I'm a Canadian, I'm in the UK. It shapes the language choice I make all the time. And you can't remove that. You can't take that away from your adult literacy teaching. And I think that the trouble that exists right now, and this is where the deficit comes in, is that we're still in this great divide that Brian Street talked about, again, many years ago when I studied with him, which is the sense of a great divide between oral versus written, right? And oral writ large in terms of other modalities that we use on a daily basis, especially with screens. So increasingly the work that I look at involves thinking about what screens do for us. And this is a telling example. Since the pandemic, we're very used to Zooming and doing these sorts of things in ways that wouldn't have really happened about 3 years ago or 4 years ago. So the oral versus written is an opportunity to think about certainly oral storytelling, but visuals and what they call kineconic modes, like moving image and obviously digital and hypertext. And Brian Street refused to grant reading and writing as a technological function, manifesting attributes outside of a social practice. So that's a sort of fancy way of saying that pushing against that notion of technology determinism. So here's a screen, therefore we're digital. If I put written text on the screen and you read it, that's being digitally literate. And there's so much more to the picture of literacy, right? So when we go online, we will curate information, we'll work across algorithms, we'll read hybrid texts, we'll know that a little bit of blue text links us to another text. Where does that text come from? And then again, that invisible dimension is, where does that text come from? Teaching critical literacy would be about what we read on the web isn't necessarily gospel. It's not some sort of omnipotent thing that arrives at you when you are online. It's something that you want to teach questioning skills. You want to be critical at critical readers. And, you know, you have some very strong Australian scholars like Barb Comer and Alan Luke who talk about really questioning and confronting these texts. So I want to just, if you'll indulge me, take a little bit of a look at the landscape of literacy and where we were and where we are now. In terms of adult literacy can be applied as well as really primary and secondary school. So I've been lucky, I've been able to work across, and I've worked with little children 3 years old all the way to 90-year-olds. So, and I talk about literacy as a social practice. So a long time ago, it feels like, there was the social turn, and that involves people who you might have heard about: Shirley Bryce Heath, James G. I mentioned Brian Street. And what they said a long time ago in the 70s and 80s is that literacy is something that doesn't just happen in school. It's something that as I said, it bleeds into or moves into the everyday. It moves into the moment we wake up, when we check our phones and we see if we have a text, or we read the newspaper if people still hold newspapers. And we do these things throughout the day that involve reading and writing and speaking and listening. And so it sounds like a fairly mundane thing, but at the time it was a big deal, because mostly there were these psychological explanations for language. And that was that we learn language in our heads and we mediate them. But instead, these individuals, theorists like Heath and G and Street, pushed back and said, hold on here. If the litmus test is about whether you can read textbooks, what about all the other constellation of skills that are on display, like oral storytelling, like being able to understand visuals? For example, moving in today and understanding hybrid text and the way I look at things like video games. So they launched a whole direction for literacy research. And what that led to was also a design turn. And the design turn was an acknowledgement that there are written modes, but there are also these other modes. And people like Gunter Kress are tied in with this, the Australians Cope and Calancis, the Multi-Literacies group. And so the design turn was quite pivotal. There was the formation of the New London group in 1996. So that's something maybe Roz knows about, Polly as well. And they chartered this sort of New London group framework about the design turn. And so once that was acknowledged and filtered into international perspectives on literacy, then there was a spatial turn. So the spatial turn was more like, what do these spaces tell us? So we know that literacy is a social practice, but what happens when you move from an institutional space like an adult literacy classroom, and then you move out into the community and you're with your group and you're suddenly hearing local dialects. I remember the beautiful fish market in Sydney. What if you go for a trip to the fish market in Sydney and you start to hear different languages that happen, and your language learners in your classroom recognize dialects? So what happens is that language starts to be shaped around the spaces where you are. Then there was something called a temporal turn, and that's the role of time. And the way this works is that Jay Lemke, another American theorist, wrote this article that was quite pivotal called Across the Scales of Time. And in the article, what he said was that the texts that we use on a daily basis carry what he calls time scales. So you might have a book that you read as a child in another dialect, or that meant a lot to you, and it was a formative text about how you learn to read. And you also remember the person you're with often. I know I struggled to learn how to read. So I remember the particular text where I turned the corner and started to become a reader. And these texts carry time with them. And things that are encountered in a classroom have very short time scales. Textbook would have a short time scale. And his metaphor that he used was with actually knives. So he talked about samurai swords as an artifact that has a very old, long time scale, whereas a kitchen knife might have a shorter time scale. So it's a way of starting to think about literacy conceptually. The post-human turn was a turn that started to happen when digital literacies became ascended. And Kate and I wrote a book called Artifactual Literacies, and that was an acknowledgement that the stuff in our lives matter. And at the time, it felt a bit fringe, but now we've really realized it with the pandemic, because we've realized that screens are very agentive. They have a very strong role in literacy in terms of how we're literate. And they're not human, really, are they? They're something, there's an object that occupies our lives. And the other big issue was the environment, and that the environment and climate change and taking care of the environment became agentive, and thinking about the ways that the environment plays a role. Now, that's a little bit of a tangent from literacy, but it's still part of this whole movement towards seeing the world as a larger picture. So that, and then finally, something I've talked about, which is the affect turn. The affect turn was a belief that literacy is something that's visible, that's something you read, but it's also something that moves us and that plays a role, and that our bodies play a role in literacy. So these are a little bit out there in terms of practical pedagogical things that relate to adult literacy, but it's something I want you to think about as a backdrop when I talk. The whole so what of that going through the history was also that literacy cannot be separated from what we do. And I love this Bloom and Green quote, which is literacy cannot be separated from what people are doing, how they're doing it, when, where, under what conditions, and with whom they're doing it. So metaphorically, there's no separation of the dancer from the dance. And I think that you certainly probably feel that with adult literacy learners, and that they're in your classroom, but there's a whole life behind these people, right? There's a whole set of assumptions, use of language in their own dialect, their own language systems, their own cultural practices, where they engage in language in very different ways from in an institutional space. So that's why we want to disrupt deficits. That's why we want to get away from that whole refugees come into our classroom and they're illiterate. And we want to think about whose voices count in literacy and why. I'm probably preaching to the choir, you already do this, but how and what ways do adult learners turn to the world? And that is, what are their own perspectives, and how can we get at that when we're teaching? How can we elicit that? How do we incorporate diverse voices in our teaching? And I'd love to hear from both Polly and Roz about that, and Keiko. And when does it move from deficit to additive, right? I quote Brian Street mostly because he had such an impact on my life. And what was taken as proof of a lack of logical processes among primitive people was often simply a misunderstanding of ill-informed European commentators. So Brian could be very subversive that way, and he would make these comments in an eloquent way at conferences. but it's important to acknowledge that and acknowledge that there are these conceptual strands that circulate when we teach. One is social practices. Social practices feed into modal learning. They feed into whether we want to use a visual or whether we want to use words or whether we want to use a blending, transmodal work. The digital plays a role in this, right? So are we going to invoke the digital? Are we going to say, nope, today we're going completely analog in our teaching? And then always thinking about moving from what do these adult literacy tests tell us we have to do, right? Which often exist in autonomous models, which often exist in assessing skills like, can we put together a sentence? Do we know our grammar? How can we move students across levels with adult literacy? But at the same time, how can we make this meaningful? How can we make language come alive for learners to see that learning English, learning other languages can be an enriching ideological process? And then how do we think about the embodiment issue in affect? What moves our learners to motivate them, really? So what this has led, certainly me to over a decade, is that Kate and I have really, I feel very lucky to be able to work with Kate Paul because she's taught me so much, and we did our PhDs together, and we've been able to have this long-term collaboration. And over the years, we've talked about how literacy's moved, and we came to this notion, I tend to think about the world now before and after the pandemic, but it was quite a bit before. And it was around 2018 where we talked about how we returned to Brian's notion. We both studied with Brian, that literacy is a verb, right? Literacy is something that's active and it's a lived practice. So we wanted to write a book and look at our research in relation to being active. So it was an intellectual project to look at literacy through the eyes of the everyday, deliberately move out of institutional context to think about literacy as it happens across the community. So literacy became, we used verbs, as I said, about seeing, about disrupting, about hoping, knowing, and, how convenient, making. So it was a collaborative project. Most of our research is co-research. We go into communities, we do action research with teachers like Polly, and I'll speak for myself, I do multimodal work with teachers where we do documentary film work or photographic work. We consider futures as well as the past and sort of the not yet, that's part of it. So we look at the past, we look at the present, we look at the future with adult learners. And a great adult literacy scholar is Mary Hamilton. And she said in a chapter in 2015, it's the threads that connect this life to other lives, times, events, and issues, the web of meanings and relationship from which Shirley's stories are assembled, that now seem of most value to me in understanding literacies. Now, the reason I put some of these in red is that I feel that it's just a really beautiful way of thinking about language, really, which is that there are these threads that connect our linguistic practices. And so a living literacies approach, and this is the book that Keiko kindly referenced, Living Literacies, Literacy for Social Change. So seeing, knowing, disrupting, hoping, and making are the key strands of it. Seeing is a chapter that I wrote based on visual work with adults, particular adults with addiction issues, and doing multimodal work with them. Knowing is a concept of understanding language on sort of a ways of knowing level. We all understand language in different ways. It's often related to who we are, our identities. And knowing had to do with a project about, believe it or not, family photos and what family photos signal about parts of ourselves and how we can read from that and compose from an understanding of ourselves. Disrupting is about challenging things in the world right now, because the world is quite contested, I would say. And so disrupting is a pedagogical move to sort of think about what are some ideologies that we can disrupt, that we feel passionate about. And I have some very good examples, I think, in a study that I'll talk about. And then finally, or I missed hoping. So hoping we have to have in there as a way of looking at the future and saying, how can we reimagine what the future is? How can we reimagine our lives in Sydney? I would be interested in, probably many of you work with refugee families. and thinking about hope that way and what futures might look like. And then making, I spend a lot of time looking at, and that's because recently I've been involved in makerspace work where you literally design and make as you learn literacy. So not only is design part of the central kind of multi-literacy strand, but also you think as you design. And it's about, certainly I've done it with children and teenagers and with some adult learners. And it's about sitting and having a problem and thinking about it and then making something, reflecting on it. And then you can write about it and then you can have literacy activities about it. So again, seeing is applying seeing as a sensory experience within literacy work. So the project I talked about with adults with addiction, they would get cameras, they would go out in the community, they would take photos, they would write compositions about them. It's seeing a familiar community artifact that resurrects memories or ways of being. And there are other ways you can look at seeing that I'll talk about with the adult literacy project I did. Knowing is about almost knowing and unknowing. So it's an invitation to think about what knowing is, what knowledge acquisition is, and thinking about knowledge in the everyday. So there are lots of cultural theorists who think this way, Roland Barthes, and others, who think about culture materials and how they influence, and we think through the stuff of our lives. Disrupting that lives, it's a powerful way of teaching adult literacy particularly, and it's about the literacies of dissent. And they're built on poetic and artistic forms of knowledge production. And it's about knowing differently. It's about taking hold of what we know, taking hold of language and rethinking it and rethinking ideas. And it's the reason it's powerful in an adult literacy classroom is that you've got learners who have these lives that come in and they're topics that they feel quite passionate about. And it's understanding that and leveraging that. Hoping is about creating an imaginative space. This is sort of Maxine Green, who talks about the ability to look at things as they could be otherwise, right? So this might be our reality right now, but it doesn't have to always be that way. And it's living literacies is paying attention to that, paying attention to sites and contexts and lived realities and how those might change, and tracing literacies across sites and seeing hope in different parts of our lives. And then finally, making is a very active thing. It's looking at the process. It's acknowledging, for example, with writing, that writing is something that evolves and follows stages. And it's felt and it's material, but it's also affective. It's also immaterial. It's also driven by things that we feel and that we believe and that we do as part of our everyday. So you'll probably have makers in your classroom. And makers could be people who knit or sew or other things, or they could be people who actually build stuff, or designers. I want to anchor this within a project so it's practical. So in 2018 to 2019, I did a project when I was in Canada, again, before the pandemic. And it was a project over really over 3 months. And it was in a welcome center in a city I lived in, St. Catharines in Canada. My university was Brock University, and I worked with refugees, and they were this delightful group of individuals, and I'll talk through where they came from. But we had a sense, and they were a mix of abilities. They were, I would say, on the lower side in terms of thinking about literacy assessment. There's a deficit way of framing them. They had some readings and writing skills in English, but not very advanced. And so we hosted 10 sessions, and those 10 sessions were all multimodal. So they were all living literacies in their approach. And this was the group of them working away during one of their sessions. And I worked very closely with an adult literacy teacher named Julianne Burgess, who's now Dr. Julianne Burgess, because she just got her PhD. And we co-taught these sessions, and I took observational notes, but I'd also work with students on certain aspects like the photo work, and we would circulate. We got to know them quite well. And some of the sessions were on things like conceptual portraits I'll look at in a minute. We had short movies they produced. They created storyboard books, collages, and some artifacts. So When I met with Keiko, she was very kind and talked about the Artifactual Literacies book, and we did activities with that. And then we had a celebration event in the Welcome Center, and we conducted interviews after. So that's a sense of the study. And we wanted to unsettle, so objectives were to unsettle the ideologically driven resettlement initiatives for newcomers. So there is this whole rhetoric about, and they couch it in ways that, you know, developing, becoming a new Canadian, all of these ideas. And we wanted to push against that a bit, because again, these people had lives before. And we also wanted to disrupt mandated adult English language as a subsequent language. It's quite deficit. I am not an expert in adult literacy, I should say that, in terms of assessment. So I don't know, but I know that there was a lot of talk within the Welcome Center about the IELTS and other quite rigid prescribed forms of assessment. So we advocated for a reconceptualization of language assessment, and that's something Julianne is an expert on. And she's also applied translanguaging, which is a way of looking at flows of language in a more open, holistic way in adult literacy classrooms. These were the learners. These are all pseudonyms. So we had a few learners from Syria, Venezuela, China, Iraq, Burundi, Colombia. So they came from a lot of different places and a lot of different languages circulating. And so we examined these lived literacies. We enacted the lived literacy approach by doing seeing work through photo, film work with participants and written narratives alongside that. Knowing, we did artifactual work about artifacts that they value and what that resurrects about ways of knowing about their old communities, their homes versus Canada as a new home. Disrupting, using arts practices to think about assumptions, often tied to previous cultures and assumptions within those cultures, with an open safe space, within an open safe space. Hoping, arts practice that explore what futures might look like, and then making and using design work to think about literacy. I hope my time's okay, I'm not going over. So Keiko, you can just tell me if I am. Making and disruptive practices. So seeing and knowing, making disruptive portraits, rather, sorry. So making a disruptive portraits was working from a conceptual photograph from a famous photographer, well, a well-known photographer in Canada, and these sort of provocative photos, and this was in a minefield in Iraq. And what they would do is we wouldn't say anything about these photos. We would just display photos like this and then have a bunch of artifacts, and they would replicate those conceptual photographs together and write a narrative about them. And so this was a delightful couple who recreated this scene in a very different way. They disrupted, I think the original conceptual photograph was quite political. And this one was really their love story. So they're a couple who were married for, I think, something astounding like 60 years, maybe even 70 years. And they were recreating the moment of marrying again. And they used artifacts to create that. Seeing and knowing. One of the things we talked about quite a bit with the women in the classroom was the notion of feminism and what that is. And I loved this particular woman from Burundi who said, she wanted to create feminism within the constraints of her own culture. She wanted to create her own, mediate her own anchoring in her own culture and belief in her culture, but also some form of freedom as well. So she looked at this photograph, and it was another conceptual photograph, and combined it with knowing, and worked with somebody else who was in the classroom to sit beside her brother and have coffee together. And so this to her was a way of making a feminist stance, that they're on equal standing together. There was an older woman who was quite quiet, and at one point we did the Every Object Has a Story about knowing. She brought out her prayer beads, and what she said was that her son in Syria was very ill at one time. And so these beads remind her of a time when she was very worried about her own family situation, her life, and she would rely on them every day, and how what they did for her in terms of create these hopeful narratives for her about about what the future would be. Knowing in culture and hopeful artifacts. This picture is not very good. I'm sorry. It's a bit pixelated, but it was very interesting for me when this was a young woman named Lynn who just had a child. And this particular artifact is tied to her culture in China. And I believe the story is that the ring, she would put the ring symbolically kind of around on her belly button around her sort of, and it would be something that would be about peaceful thoughts about the child in her womb. Now, I hope I have that right, but it was a way of knowing and an artifact that carried a story with it that became important that she wrote about. And then finally, another woman who had a very difficult time coming from Syria talked about a collage of making hopeful futures and what that looked like. So what are some takeaways? Here's the sort of semi-practical end, and I really hope that Polly and Keiko and Roz can maybe offer more in terms of this, your own work in Sydney. But arts-based work, applying visual written filmmaker, I can only say it's very powerful. I've done it for many years, many studies, applying arts-based practices within the literacy classroom, and they come alive. And they can be from very basic things to collage. It doesn't take an artist to create a collage with students, all the way to bringing in documentary filmmakers, if you can, to produce short films. So somebody I work a lot with who does adult literacy work her name is Rahat Zaidi in Canada, and she does documentary film work with adult learners. Opening teaching spaces to making, taking a makerspace approach with adult learners, bringing in stuff and having them make, and what that does for thinking and what that does to create a calming space, an affective kind of feeling of being able to learn together, think together, design together, anchoring lessons and learning in modal learning, which I'm sure you already do, and then framing teaching around what people do with literacy as active, as seeing, as hoping, as knowing, as disrupting. So that's really my talk. I promised Keiko I'd stop sharing. And I hope that that is relevant. I'm very aware of trying to be relevant for people. And I really would love a conversation, but we could also just talk about experiences that Roz and that Polly and that Keiko have had.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was wonderful, and it made me think of a lot of things. But shall I first, I don't know, ask Polly or Roz for reactions, impressions, questions?
Roz? Okay, I'll start. So thanks, Jennifer. That was so interesting, and it just reminded me of how enlivened I felt, and I think my students, my teacher education students, felt about the classroom and thinking through those ideas of having their own students using their own artifacts, their own photos, taking their own photos, and in a way that, as you said, takes literacy outside of, the confines of a textbook written who knows where for who knows whom in what age, and it actually brings the outside world back into the classroom where it should be. We should have those porous walls in the classroom. So I think for my teacher education students, that was exciting to think of how they can use all those sorts of modalities and ideas that you and Kate have shown us in your books and articles. And I think, so just one point in particular, I think with the things like having students bring in artifacts and having students bring in photographs that they can talk about. It's so empowering. And I know that's a rather overused word, but it's almost like that artifact contains some sort of power. They've brought that into the classroom, and that student who's brought in that artifact, they are the only person who can then speak about and write about that particular artifact. They have that power to do that in a way that in other activities they might not feel the ability or the responsibility, shall we say, to do that. But there they have that in their hands, and that's what they have to share. That it's like an anchor, but full of meaning and power. So I found those, the exercises that I did with my teacher education students where they brought in artifacts, I think were some of the most interesting and lively lessons. And I know Keiko probably has felt that too. And just one more thing before I stop talking on and on. Another exercise, Jennifer, that we used in that same classroom with teacher education students who were learning to, upgrading their skills in teaching literacy, was using paintings. So as well as things like photo voice and making, but having students look at paintings for an extended period of time and talking about what they could see, and giving us evidence of why they thought particular things were happening in the painting. And I think we found that a really powerful way of engaging students and their ideas and what they sort of projected into paintings, and something that the whole group could share then. But yeah, I mean, I have found all those ideas just so exciting as a way of enlivening the literacy classroom. So thank you. Thank you, you, Jennifer and Kate, for your work in that area.
Oh, thank you so much, Roz. Well, that was so eloquent. And you said a few things which I hadn't thought about before, which is that on one level, that our artifacts catalyze stories, but it actually does give an adult, a language learner, an opportunity to have some agency, that they know about this artifact, right? They're sort of, it's something that they can feel a sense of confidence about it. Or, you know, I know, learning languages, I know myself, I feel quite insecure. You feel unsteady at first. At least maybe that's my own experience. But when you can bring something in where you can say, no, I know about this and I feel passionate about it and I can talk about it. So that's a really intriguing. And I love the idea of paintings. I've only used photographs, so I would love to use paintings, and they do a different thing, don't they? They take away from a language learner being on the spot. Let's say we said, everybody read a passage. Rather than doing that, we say, tell me your thoughts about what these paintings do. Then they can start talking and dialogic, have a dialogic dimension. And like you, I mean, the artifact thing, we kind of lucked into. I did artifactual work years ago in Princeton when I lived there, and it catalyzed this, how teenagers love their stuff. And there was a book that helped me too, by Danny Miller, called The Comfort of Things. And you wouldn't have thought that the stuff in our homes mattered so much to us and would have this hidden power in a classroom, but they do. I mean, I've had the liveliest sessions with teacher education students about artifacts, and with students and with others. So yeah.
Thanks, Rose. Polly, do you want to share?
Yes, it was wonderful. Thank you. And I was reading your chapter and I was very interested about that as well. It makes me think about how, in one way, I accidentally came upon artifactual literacy when I was working with the Muslim Women's Association down in Lakemba for many years. And one of the task that I did very early after I started out teaching. We were talking about what we would take if we went to a desert island. I mean, just something to talk about. And so they talked about different things. And one of the women there, an older woman who'd come from Afghanistan, and a lot of them had been quite long residents in Australia, although they hadn't had much of a chance to get out and be learning English. And she said, I've got it right here. I'm going to show you what I'd take. And she pulled out a prayer mat and showed it to us. And she said that was the only thing when the bombs fell and they told us to leave and we had to run. That was the only thing I took. So that was her only remaining thing in her home. And sorry, I'm even crying now because literally we were crying by the end of it. But it was just, and so after that was what sort of started me. Not necessarily people bringing in something important to them, but we would bring in different things. We might have different themes. So we might bring in something with food, which would uncover. And some of the women would bring in a whole basket of different spices and say, okay, so what are all these words? How do I get it here? And it was just brilliant. It was a lovely way to do it. So if you had to work, which I did, within a more structured environment, and they had to learn certain vocabulary and be assessed and things like that, then we did it around thematics. And one girl said, after we'd done that 1 week, she said, okay, next week I'm going to bring you in some coffee because she told me you love Lebanese coffee, which they call Lebanese, although it was in her case Arabic coffee. And the next week she comes in with this huge bag and proceeds to bring out the tray, the proper coffee pot, the coffee, the little mugs, everything for all of us. There were 10 of us there, and goes through the entire, she'd hardly opened her mouth in classes before this, goes through the entire coffee making ceremony and serving it to us. And she brought cakes for us to eat as well with it. So if you can that was a mixture of doing and artifacts.
I love it. I love it. Oh, that's an amazing story. Yeah. Yeah. And that's when things really come alive, as I said. I mean, I was going to talk about another project where I worked with Julianne. We've done quite a few adult literacy projects together, and it was about body mapping, which is a medical methodology to work with patients who have cancer to kind of conceptually draw on a literal cutout of a body, where they're feeling emotionally upset. That's an odd segue, but with language learners, we decided to talk about how they feel about their languages on this body map. And I said, Julianne, is this really going to work? And some of them really took to it, and particularly one who had a very hard story about having Crohn's in Iraq and the journey to Canada for medical reasons. And she could not only do the medical bit on her, but she also started to do all these friends that were important in Iraq. She misses the food that she loves. And it was so populated, this body map, we had to kind of stop her from drawing on it. And the only reason I mention that is that there are all these different ways into looking at the lives people live through different mechanisms. And that's the language work to me. That's the teaching work that can really be, to use Roz's word, powerful. I know it's overused, but that's, I can't think of another way of describing it. And it's moving. It is moving for sure.
Well, it genuinely makes the teaching and learning reciprocal, because everybody is both a teacher and a learner at different times, which is what life is like. I mean, we learn something new every day. Something surprises us every day. And I really love that reciprocity. Yeah,
exactly. And it makes you, I mean, you were saying you felt teary. It makes you vulnerable with your students. It's not a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing to be humane and human with students, with people.
And you've inspired me to do what I did many years ago now and then haven't done since, which is we knit squares for rugs. I think it's a universal thing. I did that with a class 1 year. So we all brought in some wool and I collected the needles and everybody knitted in the class. Some people couldn't knit and other people taught them how to knit, and some people would then tell other people to take it undone, and we were trying to work, and we did maths as well, Keiko, you'll be pleased to hear, because it had to be a certain size and working out tension and all these things. It was so much fun.
Oh, brilliant. I would love to be in your classroom, because I forgot how to cast on too on a practical level.
Well, there were probably, there were 10 students who were 10 different ways of casting on. So that was also an interesting discussion.
Well, there's some very interesting makerspace work with numeracy. So a friend of mine, Anna Kuhn in Munich, does knitting work with teenagers, and they learn mathematical principles through knitting. And she computational notions she talks about through the number of, anyway, I won't go into it, but there is some very interesting work about knitting and numeracy.
And if I may, I'd just like to add to, what both Polly and Ros were saying about, the power of getting students to talk about an artifact that has some special meaning for them. And I was teaching the subject that Ros designed and taught for a few years on multi-literacies during COVID. And so the first year I taught it, everybody was on Zoom, and a lot of the students wouldn't switch on their camera and wouldn't speak. And the week that I asked each of them to, have with them an artifact that has some special meaning for them, because I was going to put them in pairs, and you were going to talk to your partner about the artifact and, the meaning it has for them. Put them into pairs, into breakout rooms, off they went. And as I hopped into the, different breakout rooms, they were, chattering away. I distinctly remember one student from Saudi Arabia. She was very quiet, hardly said anything most of the time. In fact, didn't say anything. Had her camera off. This time she did have to have her camera on to show the artifact. She was just talking about the headdress that men in Saudi Arabia wear. And, she was just, explaining why and what it's made of. And the other student who was, paired with her, he was listening with interest. And, it was really lovely, because I think what the other thing that getting students to talk about something that they are the experts on, lifts the kind of what do they call it? Cognitive load of having to talk about, some abstract concept that, on top of, for the international students, the English language to talk about whatever it is. So I think it also gave them a reason to look up the English words so that they could talk about the thing that meant so much to them. And I think it sort of carried on this year as well, which, I just finished teaching this subject, and it was the first semester since COVID when I had the students back in the classroom. So the students were kind of, getting used to working together face to face. And, they hadn't had a chance to really get to know each other. There were some international students, some local students, and somebody had, I think it was a photograph that was significant for them, but it was significant in some kind of tragic way. And so she was in tears telling the story, and, 2 minutes later, everybody was in tears. But
Yeah.
it's also a way of generating empathy, the students being able to express who they are in their own terms. And
that's a very nice way of putting it. Yeah.
So I just think,
Lovely, Keiko.
just to repeat what we've said so many times, it's such a powerful
it is indeed.
teaching.
Yeah, and something different comes up every time people discuss their own experiences. So yeah, it moves, becomes better. It's generative.
And I think it's, I mean, Polly would know, but one of the things that our adult literacy teachers say is that the curriculum that they are having to use is just so, on paper anyway, so awful. What is it? Read and comprehend routine workplace texts. They're all,
Yeah, but this is an international thing. I mean, it's
So
adult literacy gets short shrift, I think.
So it's all for work. And I think it's really easy for teachers to feel, well, this is all very lovely, but there's just no room for the nice teaching and learning activities. But I think some teachers I know, and Polly would be one, I think find ways to create the space. One of our other colleagues, talks about using artifactual literacies as an icebreaker, at the beginning of term. And I've said that, even if you have to teach, workplace texts, procedural texts, for example, well, get the students to talk about their artifact, and then, get them to talk about how that artifact is made, for example. So you can start modeling a procedure text if that's what you have to teach. So, you can segue into.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, teaching is an artistry. It's an art.
Yeah.
And so as adult literacy teachers, it's the dance of working within mechanistic kind of paradigms and making things come alive for learners. And when you see it happen, it's magic, right? So yeah, and that's kind of more of a positive spin on it. But I think you're not alone in Australia. It's the same way in the UK. It's the same way in Canada. And I don't know why things can't change and add some dynamism to adult literacy.
But we can be subversive.
Yes, we can disrupt deficits.
That's right. Yeah. Well, maybe this is a good place to finish up. I'm sure we could continue talking about this, but I'm conscious of time, so I might.
And you probably want to have your dinner and move on with your evening, or.
So I'll just say thank you very much, Jennifer, for a very inspirational and provocative and just really interesting presentation. And thank you, Polly and Ross, for coming along and sharing your experiences with multi-literacies, artifactual literacies. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you,
nice
Kate.
evening, and
Jennifer.
thank you to the participants in the conference. Enjoy. I wish I could be in the sunshine with you.